Welcome to Crossroads. The Chinese Communist Party right now is enacting policies that, at least on the surface, make it appear that China is facing a food crisis. Now look, problems around the food supply in China, they've been brewing for years. They have serious water pollution, there's natural disasters ongoing as we speak, by the way, and also the dwindling away of arable land, one of the bigger problems they're facing in the future. The Chinese Communist Party, look, they used to rely mostly on imports, but economic lockdowns, contentious global trade policies, and other issues, well, they're making that difficult. And now the regime is enacting policies that have some analysts, including myself, wondering if the food problem in China is actually worse than it seems. Now, China expert James Gorey had this to say in the Epoch Times. He said that with tensions rising between China and its main grain suppliers in the West, the war in Ukraine and growing food supply disruptions, China is facing a potential food security crisis to rival those of the past. And briefly on that, to rival those of the past, the CCP had famines in the past that killed tens of millions of people, just emphasizing how serious that is. Now, he goes on to note that in 2022, for the first time since 1989, China saw public protests against food scarcity. And he notes that between 2000 and 2020, the country's self-sufficiency ratio decreased from 93.6% to 65.8%. And as we'll be talking about more in this episode, that's important because between those same years, the CCP had policies to do the opposite, to become more self-sufficient. So what led them to become significantly less so? Now, James Gorey notes that one of the main structural factors for that is simple geography. China must feed about 20% of the world's population, with only about 10% of the world's arable land and just 6% of the world's water resources. He notes those are enduring and formidable factors. Now on this, he goes on to mention some of the main causes of the famines in China in the past. The biggest cause is being farm collectivization policies. That was a CCP policy. The regime's misallocation of land and resources, and then, well, unpredictable issues like floods and droughts. And what's particularly concerning right now in China is that all of the old factors, all the things that previously led to famines and mass death, all of them look like they're coming back right now as we speak. And the Chinese Communist Party is actually facing additional problems to that, which are likely to damage food supplies. Now look, to get around all these things, the CCP has become the world's largest food importer. And it's also moved to buy up farmland abroad, including right here in the United States. You might have heard the stories about it. China's buying farmland right here in America. But it's not just here, it's also South America, it's in Asia, it's in Africa. The CCP is buying up everything they can. But that's also now being disrupted, not only by trade disputes, but also by the war in Ukraine, one of the breadbaskets of the world, and also by rough yields in other countries. Brazil, for example, having some bad growing seasons, and China being one of the main importers of their food. Now, on this, the reality that relying on imports for survival now might not be a stable strategy, let's say, is something the Chinese Communist Party has been aware of actually for some time. But its attempts to get around this have been multi-year failures. They have failed at this year by year by year. The policy the CCP was pushing for a long time was what they called grain self-sufficiency. And the CCP's push to be self-reliant on its own food supplies is also something they need in the case of a war. What if their supply chains get cut off? Now, there's some speculation this could also be one of the reasons why the CCP is pushing its policies for food independence, because they're afraid if they do go to war, well, how are they going to feed their population? Back in 2013, the Chinese Communist Party started realizing that moderate food imports were needed to keep the country fed. But at the same time, it was also understood that if the war were to break out, say if they invaded Taiwan, for example, or if supply chains got disrupted, take COVID-19, then the food supply in China would be disrupted as well. They would not be able to import the food they would need to feed their population. Now, this led the CCP to create a new program for grain self-sufficiency, as we were discussing. And this is something they've gone back and forth with over the years as they realize it's not viable and then keep trying to make it viable. In 2015, China Economic Review said this. They said, in practice, though, these policy bombshells have proved more bluster than boom. Officials recognize that China's grain sector is subject to policies that encourage overproduction, inefficiency, wasted stockpiles, elevated prices, and perversely, mounting imports of the same crops the country already has too much of as prices abroad fall. It notes they also remain hamstrung by political tradition, fear of overdependence on imports, systematic momentum around the country's contradictory interests of the country's rural and urban regions, and they note the result is regular tides of conflicting policy overtures, muddled further by jargon and arcane categories that obscure what self-sufficiency actually means. And despite loud calls for modernization, government insistence on continued supply without regard for demand could prove unsustainable. A common problem with communism, by the way, is that the communist system tends to direct things from the top. They don't take the needs at the bottom into account when they make these blanket policies. And we're seeing that happening in China right now. The programs in China, well, they often led to serious environmental damage because they were trying to get so much out of the land that couldn't really yield what they needed. And they also weren't usually sustainable in terms of business either. They were growing the easy stuff, not the hard stuff. And because they were growing the easy stuff, well, they had too much of that and not enough of what they actually needed. But look, to keep the supplies going, what did the Chinese Communist Party do? Well, it pumped up its grain numbers by doing, well, turning to soybeans and corn. But that also had other issues because you kind of only use that to feed animals for the most part. In 2023, Voice of America said this. According to the news report, China's annual grain output exceeded 695 million tons this year, according to the CCP, by the way. They note that the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs announced that in 2024, China's overall goal for grain production is to stabilize the production of grain rations, corn, and soybeans to ensure grain output in 2024 remains above 655 million tons, according again to China's Central Television, their state-run media, by the way, on December of 24. However, it says other official data show that self-sufficiency in food rations, that's one of the key parts here, does not equal having enough self-produced food to feed the entire population. And why is that? Well, they say it here. Rations, and that's what they're calling them, rations, usually only refer to rice and wheat. But broader foodstuffs such as corn and sorghum and legumes, well, still need to be imported in large quantities. In other words, the stuff people actually are eating in China, they have to get outside of China. And they're growing the easy stuff inside of China. Now remember, the numbers from the CCP have historically not reflected the actual data. This is one of the things that's been true for most of the CCP's history. This was especially true, notably, during the Great Leap Forward, something very important to know about. That was, of course, one of the major CCP initiatives to have all the peasants go and become farmers and increase food yields, and led to tens of millions of people starving to death, as we'll talk about soon. But it also appears to be true now, frankly, because they're repeating those same policies. Yields in China are often less than what gets reported. And for example, what's being reported still falls below what the country needs to sustain itself. While they report the number, hey, we have enough food, the central authorities say you don't need any more food since you have more than enough, and then people starve to death. The real data on the success or failure of the CCP's grain self-sufficiency program does not appear to align with the Communist Party's narratives. Not only that, but because of some of the farming issues in China, grain tends to cost more there than it does even in first world countries. You can get grain cheaper in the United States with our economy than you can in China. In 2023, Geopolitica noted that notably, China's agriculture has been marred with low efficiency, as according to statistical data, the average production cost of rapeseed, for example, is twice that of Canada. And the average yield of spring rapeseed is 70% of Canada's. They can't produce the same amount. Likewise, it said the average cost of soybeans, one of the main things they produce in China because it's easy and it can grow in their ruined land. Even in China, it is 1.3 times that of the United States in price. And the yield, they say, is less than 60% of that of the United States. Researchers said that around 30% of all farmland in China suffers from soil erosion, while an additional 40% is at risk of turning into deserts. Add that up, that's 70% of their farmland at risk of going away, and even that is reduced from what it used to be. And even that was not enough to feed the country. And note that Xi Jinping expressed concerns over the fast degradation of farmland. And what did he do? Well, it says that he sought that the total farmland does not fall below the red line of 120 million hectares. And disruption of global food supplies, they say, is harmful to China, which it witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And notes that as Xi Jinping acknowledged, the Ukraine conflict showed, quote, the extreme importance of food security. They're feeling it. Now look, despite this, the CCP kept the policy of grain self-sufficiency in place, even though the policy is not working. And part of this is being caused notably by, again, global conflicts and disputes. In 2023, the Hendrick Foundation noted that as China became more integrated with global markets, it has mixed this policy with greater openness towards international markets for food imports. But now, it says, last year, the government, the CCP, appears to have reversed course and is renewing and amplifying its policy emphasis on achieving high degree of grain self-sufficiency. They're not getting off it. It notes that in President Xi Jinping's speech during the Communist Party Congress last year, which was at the time 2022, Xi Jinping stressed that China will make sure that the country's food supply remains firmly in its own hands. He promised, quote, strict protection of the farmland, strong support in agricultural research and development, particularly seed technology. You might remember, for example, Chinese spies were trying to steal GMO corn seeds from America that can grow in regions that don't have enough water. And of course, they had other measures as well they were calling for. In addition to this, it says, Xi Jinping called food security a top national priority, one of the biggest issues the CCP is facing. It notes the Chinese government swiftly introduced new policies emphasizing China's need to grow more of its own crops. It notes that in February 2023, China unveiled its #1 central document for that year, its annual manifesto on state agricultural policy. And it notes that for the first time that year, right, a grand new goal, striving to become an agricultural superpower, was set down in the document. So what's been the result of that goal of becoming an agricultural superpower? Well, it's the opposite of what they aimed for. They're not self-sufficient by any means. Actually, it's gotten worse. The Chinese Communist Party is increasingly relying on imported food. Now, I'll be talking more about this after a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges with a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold. You can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Is China facing a food crisis? Well, look, new policies enacted by the Chinese Communist Party point to a food supply crisis in the country. And as this happens, the Chinese regime is actually reversing course on some of its older policies, even recent ones, in fact. So what's been the result of that whole big shift? Well, the opposite of self-sufficiency. It hasn't worked. The Chinese Communist Party is increasingly relying on imported food. In fact, this year, the Council on Foreign Relations said this: despite its domestic production, China has been a net importer of agricultural products since 2024, a long-term failure, in other words, of the grain self-sufficiency. They note that today, and this is this year, it imports more of these products, including soybeans, corn, and remember those are the two main things they're growing domestically, as well as wheat, rice, and dairy products than any other country, any country on earth. It notes that while the Chinese government improved its national food safety standards in 2022, and that's important because that's one of the main reasons the Chinese people don't want to buy domestic food is because it's not safe. They think it's tainted. And so they claim to improve the standards of it a couple years ago. It says the country's prolonged lack of strict food safety regulations has allowed opportunistic domestic producers to produce unsafe and toxic food. Several deadly food safety scandals of the past 2 decades have hurt Chinese people's trust in local brands, leading them, it says, to prefer foreign ones. They'd rather buy outside of China. And notes that additionally, imports tend to be cheaper than local options because of higher costs and lower efficiency to grow certain food products in China. Now, despite this, and despite the evidence that the previous attempts at grain self-sufficiency, well, just didn't work, the CCP is now looking to expand the program. They're making it bigger. It's no longer talking about grain self-sufficiency. The new narrative is absolute self-sufficiency. That's what they're saying now. And part of this is ironically being done through some of the same CCP policies that historically led to serious famines and literally the deaths of tens of millions of people. Reuters notes, China's first food security law aimed at achieving absolute self-sufficiency, and that's the new line, in staple grains came into effect on Saturday, just recently, reinforcing efforts by the world's biggest agricultural importer, China, to lower its reliance on overseas purchases. It notes that the law provides a legal framework for existing guidance by the Communist Party for local governments and the agricultural industry to raise food production, although it did not give details on how the law will be implemented. It says further in, the law holds central and provincial governments accountable for incorporating food security into their economic and development plans, something that's a bit funny, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And they said that that's to ensure that food supplies remain a top priority in the country that has a painful history of famine. Also, by the way, the CCP is bringing back collective farms, and I think the significance of this can't be understated. I'll say this in a minute. But Reuters said, first of all, China passed a law on Friday, just recently, to better protect farmers' land rights and support the development of village collectives, aiming to bolster the country's ailing rural economy and achieve food security, state media reported. Now look, of course, we'll have to see whether that results in more government control over farmland or less control. But this is what's important. The 2 tiers of this, having collective farms under the farmers and having central and provincial governments accountable for food security, well, these look a lot like the bad policies that led to mass famine during the CCP's Great Leap Forward, which was around 1958. That movement killed around 15 to 55 million people in China. We don't even know how many died. The high estimate, 55 million, something gets even higher. Now, what caused that? Well, some of the same things they're doing now. But in addition to possible man-made disasters, the CCP is also facing some serious natural disasters like extreme weather, such as severe drought and record temperatures. And as this happens, the CCP is also losing arable land and clean water. Now, I'll be talking more about this only on EpochTV.com, the uncensored streaming platform of the Epoch Times. So if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, X, or Rumble, click the link in the description below to get access to the rest of this episode. Not only will you get access to my whole library of shows, but also the other great shows we have, as well as family-friendly movies, premium investigative reports, and hard-hitting documentaries on issues that I'd say really matter. In fact, my documentary, The Final War, exposes one of the biggest threats to America, the Chinese Communist Party. And in The Final War, I expose the Chinese regime's 100-year plan to defeat the United States, and frankly, what that means for America if they were to succeed. This infiltration and subversion by the CCP is one of the biggest but least understood issues that is impacting the future of this country. And it's such an important issue that I've dedicated my career to warning people about the threat of the CCP. Now, if you'd like to watch this documentary, you can find the link in the description below as well. It's called The Final War, and I'll show you a trailer before we go exclusively to epochtv.com. I'll see you there.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China.
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.